Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me? Good. So welcome to this discourse on cemetery and tombstone art. It can be a lengthy subject because it varies with cultures. Burial practices and customs have long been studied worldwide, and they have often changed over the millennia. One aspect that has not been focused on too much is the element of artistry in gravestones, particularly in bygone eras. Tombstone art is not as prevalent anymore, especially since cremation has now become the preferred choice for disposing of corpses instead of a full casket burial. In fact, that turnover has changed even just in my lifetime. I'll step away from the script here for a minute and ask, how many of you have already told your families and loved ones how you want to be disposed of when you go? Most of you. How many of you have chosen a full casket burial in a cemetery? 1, 2, 3. How many of you have chosen cremation? Look at that. And that is prevalent everywhere. People have asked me why the change in culture here in America, when everybody used to be buried in coffins and we've gone to cremation. I would say that probably the number one reason is financial. When you die, you can be cremated for around $1,000, but a full casket burial in a cemetery can cost upwards of $10,000 or more today. That's a lot of money. So, in early America and in early European countries, elaborate gravestones were regarded as a sign of class and affluence, designed to show cemetery visitors that the deceased was someone important and highly regarded. So look at this. This is an 18th century cemetery in Marblehead, Massachusetts. And you can see they did the best they could with some fairly elaborate gravestones. But look how scattered they are. They're laid out. In those days, cemeteries were not laid out very neatly. They just, when somebody died, they dug a hole where it was convenient and dumped them into it. We'll return to that subject in just a minute. In those days, gravestone carving started simply enough, and then it grew. The first settlers in what would become America had no professional stonemasons yet, so they made do with what they had. But as the population grew, so did the need for stonemasons, and in New England, it became a full-time occupation for some. Look at those. Wow. In New England, the early day colonists were more morbid about death. And cemeteries in Massachusetts particularly have many gravestones carved with death's head images, i.e. skulls with wings. On a visit to Boston graveyards that I made many years ago, I was surprised by just how many ancient markers had carved death's head images on them, and many of them with the same verse, the same ethereal verse on the stones, which read, "Stop, my friend, as you pass by, for as you are, so once was I. As I am now, so you will be. Prepare for death and follow me."
Amen.
Here's another one from the grave of one Joseph Morse in Marblehead, Massachusetts, and an epitaph which reads, "And Christ shall save my sinful dust. The grave shall rot out all my rust. This body of mine shall fashioned be like to his own in each degree. Although I rot, not one jot of my dust shall perish, as Christ in my sleep sage will me keep, till trumpet sound doth call me away."
Wow.
Many of these colonial era tombstones were carved out of slate stone, a fine-grained metamorphic rock that was easy for carving. I have read an interesting article recently about Connecticut tombstone carving, noting that due to the absence of slate there, sandstone was often used. Gravestone carvers used what was available in those days. In other parts of Connecticut, schist was used. But as time passed and the Victorian era came upon us, more and more marble was used. It did not fade or wear away as quickly. And also by the Victorian era, wealthy families started making large monuments to their loved ones with huge above-ground crypts. These kind of crypts are very uncommon today in burial practices, but not unheard of. Let's take a look at what we've got here. Here's an above-ground crypt right here in Prescott in Mountain View Cemetery. There are a few around. There's one up in Citizen Cemetery. Above-ground crypts are not as common in this particular area. They're more common in other parts of the world and in other parts of the country as well. Now take it, they're not unheard of though. Most crypts generally are not used even for full casket burials, but once in a while it's not unheard of yet. This is in the Masonic Cemetery, and that is fairly new. I think that's only a few, if you would, built within the last 10 years. A guy obviously with money to build a crypt for himself and his wife had it built in the Masonic Cemetery. And it's quite a fancy one, looking like a little house. So while crypt burial is almost extinct, it's not totally gone yet. So those early day colonial burial grounds were largely unorganized. People died and were simply buried there, as I mentioned before. There were no advance plots sold or much other organization. But this was doomed to change. What is believed to be the first chartered, organized cemetery in the United States is believed to be the Grove Street Cemetery in New Haven in 1797. They sold plots in advance, created family plots, which enabled people to make plans for when the inevitable happened. This is the entrance to it today. It's still there. So if you're ever in New Haven, visit the first chartered cemetery in America. And when you could plan in advance, you could conceive of more elaborate monuments to yourself and your loved ones. Large monuments in cemeteries from the Victorian era well into the 20th century are common throughout America. But I want to get a little closer to home, but first I want to show you a few of my favorite cemetery monuments. Look at this gentleman. This gentleman is named Eternal Silence, and he is in the Graceland Cemetery in Chicago. This is the grave site of one Dexter Graves, who died in 1844. In 1907, Graves's son passed away and left in his will that his father be exhumed and moved to Graceland Cemetery, and he left $250,000 in 1907 for this monument to be created for his father's resting place.
Wow.
Eternal Silence, that's his name, was sculpted by Laredo Taft, an important area sculptor in his day. He is made of bronze, and the backing is granite. Because of his genuinely frightening appearance, much folklore exists about him. The most common one is that if you look directly into his eyes, and he does have eyes if you're close enough, that you will see a vision of your own death. Other folklore says he cannot be photographed, that if you try, either your camera will stop working or your image will be blank. Needless to say, this story makes him one of the most photographed landmarks in Chicago. Also in the same cemetery, Graceland Cemetery in Chicago, is this little girl in glass. The glass case was put around her at some point to deter vandalism. The name on the grave is Inez Clark, who died in 1880. There has been a lot of genealogical conjecture in Chicago on who she was, too much to go into here. But what a piece of tombstone artwork, isn't it?
Yes. Beautiful.
Of course, there is a lot of folklore about Inez as well, including one that she is afraid of thunderstorms and hides from them, and that people wandering around the cemetery during storms have seen the case empty. Folklore such as this claims that many have witnessed it, but as usually the case, first-hand witnesses are exceedingly difficult to locate. You hear the stories, a lot of people have seen the phenomenon, but if you want to hear somebody say firsthand, yes, I saw it, that's a little more difficult. Well, let's get closer to home. In the western United States, such as Arizona, tombstone art was and is less common, but is not non-existent. The early day pioneer ranchers, miners, and merchants were not wealthy, and the hard lives they lived did not allow for them to think much about tributes to their deceased loved ones. They made markers out of wood, iron, and whatever they could find. There were tombstone carvers who created custom-made stones for a price. Quite a variety of tombstones can be seen, for instance, in Prescott's Citizens Cemetery on Sheldon Street, which is Prescott's original cemetery, with the first burial there going back to 1864. Here you will find markers made from granite and other stone, concrete, wood, and other materials. This cemetery even has one lone above-ground crypt. There it is. This is the resting place of one Nelson Lane, about whom very little is known. Genealogists have found very little on him. All right, let's continue on. Some graves have tall, spire-like tombstones, signifying the prominence of the deceased. The grave of Arizona Senator Henry F. Ashurst in Prescott's Mountain View Cemetery is one such example locally. He was one of Arizona's first two senators after statehood. Following statehood, he and Marcus Smith became Arizona's first two U.S. senators. Mountain View Cemetery actually has a few politicians buried there. There are even there's a governor buried there, a former territorial delegate to the U.S. Congress there. Mountain View is a significant historical cemetery. But some organizations once buried their own members with distinctive markers. Actually, let's back up. That's supposed to be the next slide. When I took Senator Asher's picture, I noticed this was behind me, and so I took a picture of it. It's a pagoda-style tombstone, but I don't know anything about it or why, but I took a picture of it as another example of tombstone art. It's very old. It looks like it may collapse one day, but it's still standing there yet. Okay, what was I saying about organizations? Let's get back to that. The Fraternal Lodge Woodmen of the World once had as one of their trademarks tombstones carved to look like cut-off tree trunks on the graves of their members, symbolizing a life cut down. These tree trunk tombstones are fairly common in older cemeteries, even in Arizona. Woodmen of the World were once fairly prominent, There is one in Prescott Citizen Cemetery, that's the one on the right. There's one in the Pioneer Cemetery down in the town of Congress in southern Yavapai. The one on the left is in Clarkdale's Valley View Cemetery. By the way, the woodmen of the world over the years, they kind of still exist. They metamorphosed into an insurance company, and they still exist as Woodman Life Insurance. You can visit their website, Woodman Life. But they have started out as a fraternal organization, and yeah, they buried their deceased lodge members with tree trunk tombstones. So, this is the grave of famed jurist Edmund Wells in the Masonic Cemetery. Can anyone tell me, again, apologies to any Masons here, I stood outside your fence and took the picture. Can anyone tell me what this tombstone is made of? No one? It is called a white bronze monument, even though it is neither white nor bronze. It is made out of zinc. For a time in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, these were made and sold cheaply to grieving families who wanted something impressive to mark the grave of their loved ones without their having to pay too much money. Reportedly, the Monumental Bronze Company of Bridgeport, Connecticut, was the first firm to offer these kinds of markers, though other companies eventually joined in. They were usually four-sided, and you could have them custom made in a variety of sizes and shapes with verses or whatever on the plaques on the four sides. Because they were cheaply made out of zinc, these monuments are hollow. But being made of zinc, these so-called white bronze monuments do not rust, so many of them have held up fairly well over the many generations. However, when you visit old cemeteries that have these, you will see that some of them, or one or more sides, have missing plaques caused either by time or vandals. Citizen Cemetery on Sheldon Street reportedly has the largest number of these white bronze monuments in the area. I have been told in the state, but I can't verify that. There are quite a few of those in Citizen Cemetery. As you can see right there, there's one, two, at least three in that picture. There's more up farther. Some statues in America's cities and towns were also forged from molten zinc for the same reason. It cost less. And most average people who saw the statues erected probably didn't know the difference. Now take a look at this. And this is in Citizen Cemetery. I mentioned damaged white bronze markers. Here are some of their missing their plaques, like I mentioned, caused either by time or vandals. Like we said, they were cheaply made. I'm not sure how many there are in Citizen Cemetery. I did not count. Now, religious denominations can play a role in cemetery art as well. For example, Roman Catholic cemeteries usually have many images and small statuary of Jesus Christ and the Virgin Mary on their graves. Interestingly, like here's one, this one is in Mountain View Cemetery. And there's a psalm at the base. I will say of the Lord, he is my refuge and my fortress, my God, in him will I trust. By the way, just because I noticed something in the picture just now as it came up, I'm going away from script. Can anyone tell me what that thing in the background is?
Is it a columbarium?
Looks like a wall.
That is a columbarium. And their cemeteries have them now. We established earlier how many people now cremate their loved ones. If you still want a marker in a cemetery and you're cremated, you can be inurned in one of those. They have little drawers in the back there. Now back to Roman Catholic cemeteries. Interestingly, there has never been a separate Catholic cemetery in Prescott. Other towns have them, including Cottonwood and Flagstaff and the cities in the valley, but not Prescott for some reason. There are local legends that Prescott once had a Catholic cemetery that was later moved or built over, but historians have found no evidence of this. Let's talk a little bit about some of our area cemeteries. Citizen Cemetery was the first burial there was of a Colorado state legislator who died in a hunting accident in 1864, the year that Prescott was founded. Instead of shipping him home to Colorado, they buried him in a little area outside of town, as it was recorded then. Prescott was so small that what is now Citizen Cemetery was outside of town. And as more people died in Prescott, more were buried there. There are many unmarked graves in Citizen Cemetery, many of which probably had markers at one time, because for many years that cemetery was in a state of disrepair and neglect. If you've ever visited Citizen Cemetery, you'll see there are large blank areas. Well, those are all unmarked graves. Citizen Cemetery is full. And a lot of people who you find obituaries of in our old newspapers, but yet no record of their burial, are probably there in those unmarked graves. They closed Citizen Cemetery in 1933 because it was getting too full. Mountain View Cemetery, which is out there across the way from the hospital, opened in 1911 and was considered more upscale. A lot of Prescott pioneers are buried there, and a few families had their loved ones exhumed from Citizens to be reburied there because it seemed more upscale, and Citizen Cemetery was already starting to fall into a state of neglect. Other cemeteries in the area is the Pioneer Home Cemetery up on the hill off of Iron Springs Road. Up there is where Charlotte Hall is buried. Yes. The question is, who maintains Citizen Cemetery? Yavapai County. So if you have a complaint about it, you complain to them. For many years, a group called the Yavapai Cemetery Association maintained it, and they were formed specifically to care for Citizen Cemetery. But because their people were starting to eventually get old and they couldn't recruit more people, they had to disband, upon which time the cemetery control reverted to Yavapai County. Mountain View Cemetery and also the Oddfellows Cemetery at the end of Virginia Street are both owned and maintained by Heritage Memory Mortuary. They're over here on Grove Street. They also maintain the Heritage Memorial Park in Prescott Valley. I just mentioned the Oddfellows Cemetery. The Oddfellows, the International Order of Oddfellows, was a fraternal organization again. They still exist, but they're not as large as they once were. Prescott no longer has a branch. Quite often, tombstones for their members consisted of a little linked chain carved into it with three links, which was the symbol of their lodge. Other cemeteries, the Pioneer Home Cemetery obviously is owned and operated by the Pioneers Home. For most of its existence, burials were restricted to people who lived in the Pioneer Home. They more recently opened it to anyone. If you want a full casket burial, you can buy a plot there now. The reason for that is because so many people now choose cremation. It is not a financially worthwhile endeavor to open a new cemetery since full casket burials have become so few. A lot of people ask me too about Rolling Hills Cemetery, which is out by the airport. That is owned and maintained by the city of Prescott. If you don't like what they do out there, and it does look pretty dumpy sometimes, you complain to them. That cemetery was opened in the early 30s as a, shall we say, a lower-end cemetery for people who, say, could not afford plots in Mountain View Cemetery. The Prescott Yavapai tribe, Indian tribe, has their own tribal cemetery. You will never visit it because you can't visit it without permission. It is on the reservation. My understanding is Native Americans are a holdout on the cremation thing because they believe that the bodies, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but I've always heard that they believe the decay, the decomposition of a body is symbolic of the soul's journey to the next world. So most tribes do not cremate. The question is, are there people do we know of any graves on private land sites as opposed to cemetery? Oh yes, there are a number throughout Yavapai County where, especially going back to the old days, where ranching families buried their loved ones on their own property. You could do that back in those days. Today, you have to get special permission to do that, which may not even be granted. However, if you're cremated, if you have your loved one cremated, that's a different story, since you can take your loved one's cremains and heck, you don't even have to bury them anymore. You can have them sitting on your shelf forever if you want. It's kind of funny how the law works that way. Right now, in fact, in my apartment, I have the cremated remains of a friend, and I have his cremains because no family member or anyone stepped forward to claim him. So after 2 years, they let me claim him. My hope is eventually to get him sent home and buried in Detroit. So as cremation has taken over the burial process, tombstone artistry has become less and less common in modern times. It's not unheard of, though. I don't have the picture here, but I saw an article online recently where a guy he had a small son in a wheelchair who died, and he buried his son, and he commissioned a statue to be placed on his son's grave, showing his son leaping upward toward heaven out of his wheelchair. But walking around cemeteries, especially older ones, can be a fascinating experience for those with an artistic eye. So, any more questions? Yes. The question is, does the VA cemetery, which is out there at the corner of 89 and 69, have any tombstone art? They really do not, because military tombstones are pretty much alike. They've changed in design over the years. There are the oldest military tombstones are white, and they have the person's name and what war they served in and what rank, but oftentimes they don't even have the year of birth and death on them. And some military tombstones, they've gone in different colors from green to white, but they all pretty much have the same design. Since you brought up the subject, though, I will give you some trivia. For military tombstones that stand upright and are not flat stones, most of them are curved at the top. But you may notice an old one here and there that is triangular at the top. Can anyone tell me what the difference is? She can, because I've told her. Anyone else if you go to a cemetery, and there are a couple of them in Citizen Cemetery that have the triangular top, the military stones, it means that the soldier buried there was actually a Civil War veteran in the Confederate Army. So I think, and I understand the question, are there any infamous people buried in Prescott? Of course there are. Are there any restrictions in visiting their graves? There's only a couple that I'm aware of, and I hear everybody's ears pricking up on that. This isn't so much today anymore because, as I said, the Yavapai Cemetery Association is now defunct. But in Citizen Cemetery, there is a row of unmarked graves you can see on the cemetery map that where several of this area's legally hanged murderers are buried. The Yavapai Cemetery Association did not want that location revealed to anybody because they were afraid of vandals with shovels. However, having said that, a couple of years just before the association had to disband, we did get permission from them to put a marker because at the grave of the hanged man, the outlaw Fleming Parker. Because out of all of them, I felt a little sympathy for him. People laughed that I felt sympathy for him. No, he was not a good man, but his crime so outraged the community that if he had faced anything but the hangman, there probably would have been a lynch mob. But in fact, from a legal point of view, he should have been charged only with second-degree murder instead of first-degree murder. Because for even his attorneys at his trial argued that there was no premeditation for the murder he committed. He did it on the spot. And usually for a charge of first-degree murder, you have to establish premeditation. But they went ahead and charged him with first-degree murder because if he had faced anything less than the hangman, there would have been a riot in town. So I and Elizabeth and Melissa Ruffner got together and we bought him a marker. And you never heard about it because, again, Yavapai Cemetery Association did not want any publicity for the row where the hanged murderers are buried because they were afraid of vandals with shovels. The only other place where somebody, I won't say the word infamous because he's not infamous, that I know of where you really can't visit is out at Arcosanti. Their founder and builder, Paolo Soleri, is buried out there with his wife, but you cannot visit his grave. It's on an area that is restricted from people going around.
In Mountain View Cemetery, there is a fenced area toward the back that we were told was a pauper's cemetery. What do you know about that?
That is actually correct. It is not part of Mountain View Cemetery. That is the Yavapai County Indigent Cemetery, where people who have no family or go unclaimed are buried at county expense. There had been two previous sites. The original Yavapai County Indigent Cemetery is now in the Citizen Cemetery. It's that section where you see a bunch of little tiny white look-alike concrete stones. That part of Citizens was the original Yavapai County Paupers Cemetery, where people were buried at county expense. They later opened a new one where the Prescott High School is today, and they exhumed all of them to build the high school ball field and reinterred them in a mass grave in what is now the current Yavapai County Indigent Cemetery. There are, referencing the Chinese, there is a corner of Citizen Cemetery where there are still a couple of very old markers with Chinese inscriptions on them. Citizen Cemetery in the old days was largely segregated. There's like a Mexican section, there's a Chinese section. There's only a little bit of the Chinese section left because at some point in the 1960s, they widened Sheldon Street and wiped out 4 rows of graves.
Where did those bodies go?
They reportedly, and I have not documented this, but they reportedly were taken out and dumped in a mass grave at Rolling Hills out by the airport. And if you've been to, and it's not marked, there's nothing marked there for it, but if you've ever been to Rolling Hills, there certainly is plenty of room for a mass grave, and that's probably true. Speaking of Rolling Hills, there are a couple of Chinese markers out there too. That has led some people to mistakenly hear that it was a Chinese cemetery, and no, it is not. Okay. Thank you very much. Happy Halloween.